So Joe Biden, in a recent interview with BuzzFeed, basically made the point that while he wants Republicans to vote for him in this election, he doesn't want the Republican Party to get quote-unquote clobbered. He doesn't want the Republican Party to suffer too deeply because he feels that the Republican Party plays an essential role in American democracy, that it plays an essential role as the quote-unquote countervailing force. And here's the thing. I don't think this is Joe Biden speaking in idealistic terms about democracy. There is a point to be made about how even if you're a partisan of one particular political party, you don't support one party rule because you feel ultimately for a democracy to exist, you need more than one choice. You need more than one party. That even if you want to win every election every time, you know that people need to have options at their disposal. And that without that, your claim to democratic legitimacy is less than legitimate. That's all fine and good, but that's not what Joe Biden, I think, is saying. Joe Biden is not just defending the existence of an opposition party to his own. He's explicitly defending the Republican Party. And he's done this before. People on Twitter have noted that even during Watergate, he was worried that, with Nixon's scandals, it would hurt the Republican Party and it might take that party down. And he didn't see an alternative. And he was worried about what America would look like without the Republicans. But again, I have to underline the desire for a multi-party system. Most countries have multi-party systems. In fact, most Western democracies have more than two parties that are viable to pick in an election. The United States is one of the few that is a true, two-party system at the national level. The reality is that he's defending the Republican Party, and he's doing it because of the good cop, bad cop routine that Joe Biden has been essential in for his entire political career, and that has driven American politics until very recently with the rise of, true progressive energy in the Democratic Party via people like Bernie Sanders. So for a long time, the relationship of the parties was symbiotic. They fought, they often didn't like each other, they had disagreements, but they served the same broad social and political and economic objectives, which was to promote the kind of neoliberalization of the United States, the weakening of unions, the dismantling of social programs, the resistance to things like universal health care, the rising cost of education, the declining standard of living for millions of working class people, the hollowing out of the working and middle classes due in part to things like globalization, where the benefits of that globalization existed, but were not in any way even remotely equitably shared. This was Republican policy and Democratic policy. And the thing that made it work was the good cop, bad cop routine. The Republicans play the bad cop. The Democrats, the centrist neoliberal Democrats, played the good cop. They talked about balancing progressive issues and progressive policies with hardline economic realism. And the Republicans looked like the bad guys. So that when the Republicans took power, they hacked and they slashed and they demonized. The Democrats could come back in on a, facade of progressiveness and compassion. But at the end of the day, they never really reversed things all the way back on economic terms. They never did that, right? The move towards the rich, towards the powerful, towards the corporations, away from regular working class people and unions and other progressive organizations was never actually stemmed by Democrats. The Republicans would move the country a few steps back. The Democrats would move them a bit forward, but never as much as the Republicans moved them back. And Joe Biden, who was vice president for 8 years, but before that was a long time, legislature at the federal level. He was in the Senate for a long time, for instance, was part of that process. And the Republican Party is essential. A weak Republican Party, a perpetually weak Republican Party, would force the Democrats to have to reckon with their own actual voters and base and the left wing of their party. If the Republican Party was weakened for 10 years or 15 years because of, the fallout to Trump and his scandal-ridden regime, then Joe Biden worries that for all the Democratic victories, which would look good on paper to people like Biden as somebody who wears the blue D on his shirt. It's actually bad for him because they can't use the Republicans as the big bad wolf to justify their own neoliberalism and to at least partially hide their own economic regressiveness. That's the role of the Republican Party within the sort of right-wing Democrat and Republican Party, ecosystem. And Joe Biden has long understood this, and he's been clear about it. That's why he defends the Republicans. He worries about a scenario where Bernie Sanders, say, becomes president, and the Republicans are clobbered, and they get clobbered again 4 years later. And then his neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party no longer has a viable, strong Republican base to work with, either by virtue of the fact that they have sufficient votes to tie up progressive legislation in Democratic-held legislatures and presidencies, or whether there's a situation where Joe Biden gets to be president, but there's a Republican Senate or a Republican House that effectively prevents him from doing anything, because Joe Biden would be A-okay with the status quo. Everything as it is, Joe Biden would be fine with it. So Joe Biden could say, look, I wanted to do some good things, but those gosh darn Republicans stopped me. Those gosh darn Republicans are the bad guys, don't you know? But Joe Biden would secretly thank his stars the Republicans did at least decently enough in the election to keep one of the houses or to stop a majority of progressives actually having the ability to implement policy. And we see similar things here in Canada. The Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau needs Andrew Scheer, and Andrew Scheer needs Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau, without a boogeyman conservative, that he can point to, one, would not get strategic votes here in Canada, and two, would not be able to pass off the most milquetoast, progressive policies as actually, bold in any way without, being able to compare himself to the Conservatives. So if the Conservative Party was to just disappear in Canada, all of a sudden the Liberals would become the Conservative Party, and then the NDP would be seen as the default party of progressives. And I think that's what Democrats in the States worry about if the Republican Party is actually weakened. This is why, for instance, in New York State, some Democrats at the state level actually caucused with Republicans to ensure that they could block the actual progressive legislation Democratic voters wanted. So they became Republicans to stop their own ability to pass legislation. For a lot of centrist Democrats, people like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, they don't see their role in politics to actually implement the values and policies that Democratic voters want. They see their goal as a conduit to moderate the Republican Party and the left wing of their own party and implement some sort of neoliberal status quo, or to allow the Republicans to reverse things as much as they can and for them to carry the football back a few yards, but never enough to make positive gains in the economic direction. That's what this is all about. And again, you don't have to have the specific Republican Party to have a democracy in the United States. If Joe Biden was really that worried about one-party rule, and that's why he needs the Republican Party, well, then I have to tell him it would be good for the United States if the Republican Party died an inglorious death and was thrown into the dumpster of history. That party deserves nothing less than that. And if the Republican Party got clobbered and died, well, then you could split the Democratic Party in two. And you could have the neoliberals like him and Buttigieg and Clinton on one side, and you could have legitimate progressives on the other. And those could be the two parties. Both of those parties would have disagreements, but neither would be as cartoonishly evil as the Republicans under people like Donald Trump. You would have your democracy, you would have your meaningful choice, you would have your meaningful debate, you would have the ability for various parties and interest groups to promote checks and balances upon one another, without having to say that the Republican Party, the party of modern racism and homophobia and xenophobia in the United States, has some sort of divine purpose to play. No party deserves to just exist, especially the Republican Party. If you want to preserve a multi-party system, I'm with you 100% on that, but you don't need to actually defend this party. Joe Biden wants to defend them because ideologically, He knows the value of the Republican Party to his own neoliberal vision. And if we're being perfectly honest, guys, if we're being 100% honest, if the Democratic Party actually began to reflect the values of actual Democratic voters and was led by somebody like Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden would sooner vote for Trump and sooner become a Trumper than actually remain a Democrat, because his values at core are far more on the right side of the spectrum than they are on the left side of the spectrum when you look at things in international terms. So these sort of statements, people sort of just glance by them sometimes. But when Joe Biden says this, he's really saying something quite important about how he envisions his role and his fellow neoliberals' role in the American political system. And it shows how he can't be trusted to achieve anything progressive if he becomes president. Whether the Republicans hold one of the legislative houses or whether or not it's a Democratic sweep, Joe Biden will look to work with Republicans to quash progressive movements forward. He cannot be allowed to become the Democratic nominee.